So just want to say a few things about Tyler, give him a little introduction. Tyler's been here a while. So he went through our undergraduate program and now the graduate program. And so he is one of the first students to be presenting his thesis as a second year. He's been really active in research throughout his time here at CSUSM. And some of you may not know this, but he is a co-author on 2 papers already. And most likely will be on a few others before going on to do great things. Those of you who know Tyler know he's very active and highly energetic and very enthusiastic. And I've always appreciated that about him. Always has a great attitude and works hard, and he's always willing to help. So I'll also add, he surfs pretty well for his age. That's a little bit of an inside joke. This particular study was commissioned by Hurley, and you'll see that Tyler collected quite a bit of data, some of it rather quickly so that we could provide information to Hurley. And then we decided to add some measures after that kind of pilot period. So you'll see that. Tyler will explain more about that. Obviously, we didn't foresee the coming shutdown of the laboratory and limitations that we would have. But I think Tyler still has managed to acquire a sizable amount of data. And we still think there's a lot of valuable information here and more than enough to inform wetsuit design. And so overall, I think Tyler's done a fabulous job. And I'm going to let him take over and tell you about his project. So take it away, Tyler.
All right. Thank you for the nice introduction. That was wonderful. It's much nicer than what Sean would have gave me. Okay. So let's see. All right, I can assume you all hear me. Can you confirm, Jeff, please? Assuming that's a yes. All right. So my thesis is titled Neoprene versus Thermoplastic Elastomer Wetsuits, Comparison of Biomechanical and Physiological Variables in Simulated Surfboard Paddling. A little bit of a different title compared to the announcement. So I'm Tyler Wiles, and the committee consists of Dr. Jeff Nessler, Dr. Sean Newcomer, and Dr. Matt Schubert. Why are you not going? There we go. So starting with the outline, beginning with the introduction, that includes the background, neoprene versus thermoplastic elastomer, and the goals, purpose, and hypothesis, followed along with the methods, including subjects, protocol, equipment, and our analyses, and then we'll finish it up with some results, discussion, and conclusion. So beginning with our background, there was an estimated 37 million surfers worldwide in 2013, and many of these surfers are going to require wetsuits depending on their geographical location and the environment that they're surfing in. And all wetsuits are made from neoprene, and they provide 2 layers of insulation. The first layer is the actual layer of neoprene that separates the skin from the water. And then there is a layer between the skin and the neoprene that can be filled up by water and heated by the body, if not flushed out over time. And there are many different wetsuit options. So you could see beginning with a full suit in the middle. There are normally 2 standard wetsuit sizes, including the 3.2 millimeter and the 4.32 millimeter wetsuits. With the 3.2 millimeter, the first number represents the thickness in the torso, and the second represents the thickness in the extremities. And for the 4.32, the progression of thickness is the legs, followed by the torso, and then the arms. In addition to the variability within full suits, you can also use wetsuit tops, as you see on the left side, or spring suits, or any other number of wetsuit combination, depending on what temperature they're designed for. And in addition, in order to help with thermoregulation, you can add booties, gloves, or a hood, as you can see on the picture on the right side. So what do we know about wetsuits, and do they impact performance? Well, the basis of our knowledge comes from swimming in a wetsuit. When you compare swimming in a wetsuit versus swimming without a wetsuit, there's a 7% decrease in open water swim times, a 10% increase in short sprint speed, and you also have increased energy efficiency at low velocity, as well as buoyancy, and decreased drag and decreased oxygen consumption. And this is great for swimming, and it provides a great foundation. However, we need to be able to translate this into surfing. And unfortunately, there was not much data on the paddling in a wetsuit versus paddling without a wetsuit. However, the one study that looks at this, the authors stated that it may enhance proprioceptive acuity through increased complexity and movement variability, as well as increased sagittal wrist motion. They also found that wetsuits do not increase paddling resistance. However, they did find increases in middle deltoid activity, but no change to shoulder range of motion or oxygen consumption and heart rate. And however, the limitation with the study is that they studied wetsuit tops and not full suits that will be used by most Southern California surfers throughout most of the year. So what do we know about wetsuits today? Well, wetsuits were created almost 70 years ago, and they haven't progressed much in design and functionality. So they're still using neoprene, otherwise known as polychloroprene, which is a petroleum-based synthetic rubber with high tensile strength and stretch, and resistance to temperature, water, and deterioration. And as you can imagine, the fact that neoprene is a type of rubber, it has a very poor environmental impact, and it's hard to recycle these products. In addition, neoprene wetsuits need to go through vulcanization, which is using metal oxides to bind polymers through heat, and this is a long, costly process. And finally, there are many health hazards when handling polychloroprene, including the fact that it's a carcinogen, it's very flammable, and it's been known to give malignant tumors in rats. And additionally, many workers experience many adverse health symptoms, including death in one case when handling the production of polychloroprene. And for these reasons, we need to think of or develop alternative materials that can be more environmentally friendly and safer for handling. And one of these materials may be thermoplastic elastomers, otherwise known as TPE. These are created from injection molding, extrusion, blow molding, or thermoforming, and they use a mixture of polymer compounds to create plastic and rubber properties. In addition, when you compare it to neoprene, there is no vulcanization process and reduced in cycle times, cost, and energy. And there's also many various recycling techniques, such as taking the original TPE product, melting that down, and then creating a brand new product out of that same material. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the timeline of creating a neoprene product in a TPE product, with your 4 stages of creating neoprene with vulcanization at the end and scrap at each stage. Whereas with TPE, you just have your raw material, you shape it, and you create your product, and you can use the recycled scrap to make even more. And finally, when you compare TPE to neoprene, it has similar resistance to the environment, tearing, and abrasion between the materials. So bottom line, TPE is a more environmentally friendly material and may be more cost-effective when creating it into a wetsuit. And so what are the goals of a TPE wetsuit? Well, it should have physiological and biomechanical properties that are equal to neoprene and should provide warmth without increasing energy expenditure, impeding range of motion or mobility, or negatively affecting paddling performance. And paddling performance is really important for surfers because we spend 50% of an hour-long session paddling, and we also have no research on the performance of alternative materials during paddling. Which leads us to our purpose, and our purpose is to determine if there are biomechanical or physiological differences between the neoprene and TPE wetsuit worn by experienced shortboard surfers during simulated paddling. And our hypothesis is that there will be no significant differences in oxygen consumption, heart rate, muscle activation, arm kinematics, or force output between a neoprene or TPE wetsuit. And so how did we go about testing this? Well, we took 17 male surfers from the Southern California area, all between ages 18 to 50, with at least 5 years shortboarding experience, and those that can fit into a medium-sized wetsuit. Subjects were excluded if they had any contraindications to physical activity, according to an AHA ACSM health and safety questionnaire, and any subjects unable to finish protocol were within the exclusion criteria. Moving on to our protocol, upon arrival to the lab or prior to arrival to the lab, subjects were instructed not to consume any caffeine 3 hours before testing, not to work out or surf the day of testing, or to wear any lotion. Upon arrival to lab, they signed off on informed consent, filled out a health and surf history form, and they were given a post-test questionnaire regarding the comfort, fit, and preference of the 2 wetsuits to be answered after the trials. The next step was instrumentation, which I will go over in the next slides, and then we have our actual trials. So we had 3 trials, each 7 minutes long, with our subjects paddling at a rate of 40 strokes per minute with an output of 20 watts. So our subjects went through their first trial, followed by 30 minutes of rest, their second trial, and another 30 minutes rest, and then the final third trial. And after that third trial, our subjects filled out the post-test questionnaire accordingly. The first of our equipment is the Polar T31 heart rate monitor, located just below the sternum, recording heart rate at every second. And that data was sent to the Polar RCX5 wristwatch, placed on the nose of the board. In order to record oxygen consumption, we used a Biomechanical metabolic cart, recording relative and absolute VO2, and that displayed the data at 15-second intervals. Our subjects were connected to the Met cart by a 15-foot hose and the Hans Rudolph oronasal VO2 mask. And we recorded air temperature, humidity, and pressure for all of our subjects with the Vantage View wireless weather station. Moving on to our EMGs, we used Delsis Trigno surface EMG electrodes, recording at 1200 Hertz. And these were held in place by dual-sided adhesives and Tegaderm 3 bandages. You can see we have 7 locations, all located on the right side of the body. And those locations include the middle and posterior deltoid, the latissimus dorsi, the upper and middle trapezius, the erector spinae, and finally the serratus anterior. Moving on to our motion capture, we use an 8-camera Qualisys Ocus 5 motion capture system, recording at 120 Hertz. And you can see the markers down at the bottom right. We use 21 reflective marker locations located on the left and right side of the body. And those include the iliac crest, the PSIS, the mid-thoracic region, as well as the C7 vertebrae, the right back, which is the medial side of the spine and the scapula, the acromion, the medial and lateral epicondyles, the radial and ulnar styloid processes, the lateral aspect of the humerus, which was defined as the midway between the shoulder and the elbow, and the lateral aspect of the forearm, midway between the elbow and the wrist. Our subjects were also able to audibly hear the cadence they're supposed to be paddling at, so that was facilitated through a metronome app set to 40 beats per minute, and they were able to see their real-time power output. And that was done by having a researcher standing in front of the ergometer holding a Samsung tablet, which showed the live display of a GoPro Hero 7 Silver, which is pointed to the display of the simulated power meter program. And the power meter program showed the live watt output of the left and right arm combined. That was also recorded, as well as the strokes per minute were recorded in the power meter program. And the last piece of equipment was the Transducer Techniques SBO 200 force sensor, recording right arm forces at 1200 Hertz. Moving on to the wetsuits we used the Hurley Advantage Elite 32+ millimeter wetsuit with a TPE weighing 1.02 kilograms and Neoprene weighing 1.36 kilograms. And these weights were both taken while they were dry. Our subjects paddled on a modified Bassus Bench ergometer with the surfboard bolted on at an angle of 10 degrees. And this angle is based on previous research that shows the actual planing angle of the board is 10 degrees while you're paddling in the water. And here you can see on the picture on the right side, our subject has all of his motion capture markers on. His EMGs are below his wetsuit. He has his oronasal mask on connected to the Met cart, and we have our researcher standing off screen holding the Samsung tablet. And our last piece of equipment is the force transducer, which is behind his left hand here. We also have a footrest in order to help prevent fatigue, as well as simulate the little bit of float that occurs in the legs while you're paddling in water. Some extra notes. For the motion capture, EMG, and force data, we recorded from minutes 2 to 4 and 5 to 7, and we did a randomized trial order between TPE, Neoprene, and the subject's own board shorts. Obviously, our subjects had to change wetsuits between trials, so the EMGs remained in place, but the motion capture markers had to be replaced between each trial, and they were placed in their appropriate locations by the same researchers. In addition, we measured board position preference, so we instructed surfers to lay on the ergometer prior to the first trial and find a comfortable position. And we measured from the top of their head to the nose of the board in order to create equal placement between our 3 conditions. And finally, this was a double-blind study, so neither the subjects nor the researchers knew which wetsuit was being used at the time of data collection. Moving on to our variables. So for our kinematic data, we are going to be looking at stroke length, height, and width in the peak and minimum height, also the peak shoulder and elbow flexion and extension. We also have the peak shoulder adduction and abduction and shoulder and elbow range of motion. Moving on to our force transducer, the data includes force, power, peak force and power in the percent of the stroke where that occurs, as well as the mean propulsive power and the mean power in the entire stroke. We also have EMGs, which are the middle and posterior deltoid, the latissimus dorsi, the upper and middle trapezius, and finally the erector spinae. For physiological data, we'll be looking at steady-state oxygen consumption, which was minutes 3 to 7, as well as average heart rate. And for our ergometer data, we'll be looking at left and right arm power and the strokes per minute in the right arm. For our data processing, we use motion capture, labeling, and gap filling through the Qualisys Track Manager software, and using custom MATLAB routines to eliminate any artificial and unnatural movement. And we use Visual 3D to calculate our shoulder and elbow angles. And our data was all put through a low-pass, 4th order, 20 Hertz Butterworth filter. And in order to compare our data, we had to create one-stroke models, and that was done by taking the motion capture marker of the stylo process of the ulna of the right wrist. And as you can see on the model here, when the right hand is in the most forward position, that is the beginning of one stroke. As the hand comes all the way down during the propulsive phase, down to the legs, that is 50% of a stroke. And when it comes through back to the recovery phase and back to the start of the stroke, that is the completion of one stroke. And so each trial was chopped up into these individual strokes, which were then averaged between all of the strokes of all of our subjects, and then compared between our 3 conditions. For our statistical analysis, we used RStudio to run a repeated measures ANOVA with a significance of 0.05 for minutes 2 to 4 for our EMG, motion capture, transducer data, minutes 3 to 7 for oxygen consumption. And for the entire trial, we also looked at average heart rate and the ergometer variables. And all data is presented as mean plus or minus standard deviation. To find any outliers, we used Tukey's box plot method, which found outliers in age, weight, your surf and surf competency. When you compare the statistical analysis with and without the outliers, there is no change in significance. Therefore, all outliers are included within the final analysis. Moving on to our excluded data, we excluded the serratus anterior EMG data for all subjects because based on visual inspection of the data, there was too much noise and motion artifact in order to be deemed acceptable for statistical analysis. For the rest of our EMGs, we lost around 3 to 6 trials due to equipment failure to collect data and a lack of adhesive due to sweat, which caused the EMGs to fall off the skin. Regarding the ergometer, we lost 4 trials due to failure to collect data, and for our shoulder and elbow angles, we lost 3 trials due to motion capture markers falling off during data collection. And finally, for our transducer, we lost 6 to 11 trials due to failure to collect data, as well as late IRB approval. We added the transducer after we had already collected a few of our first subjects, which is why we have such high excluded data. So our results. Well, we found no significant differences for any of our variables between any of our 3 conditions. However, we can dive into this a little deeper. So our subjects had a mean age of 24.471 years. They were 1.787 meters tall on average and weighed 70.387 kilograms. They also had 12.176 years of surfing experience, and on a surf competency scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being beginner and 10 being expert, our subjects rated themselves a 6.882 out of 10 on average. Next, we can look at our trial characteristics. So with all of my tables, it'll always be control, followed by Neoprene, followed by TPE. You can see that there are no significant differences between any of our conditions for our trial characteristics, which includes room temperature, paddling cadence, right arm power, and the mean power of the entire stroke. Moving on to our oxygen consumption, we can see here on the y-axis, we have the relative VO2, and on the x-axis, we have time in minutes, but there are 15-second interval points throughout the graph. And this is the average VO2 at each 15-second interval for all subjects between our 3 conditions. Something to mention for this graph and all future graphs is that the TPE will always be solid gray, Neoprene will always be checkered black, and the control is always the solid black line. And down at the bottom, you can see steady state VO2 between our 3 conditions. with TPE having a value of 13.266, neoprene was 13.075, and control was 12.695. Moving on to our EMGs. Here we can see EMG muscle activation is the area under the curve, and we can see that there are no significant differences for any of our conditions. For the posterior and middle deltoid, the latissimus dorsi, your upper middle trapezius, as well as the erector spinae. We can see this visualized in these graphs here. So we have muscle activation in millivolts on the y-axis and percent of stroke cycle on the x-axis. We need to remember that 0% is when the right hand is all the way forward, 50% is when the right hand is down by the legs, and finally 100% is when the hand is all the way forward again. And this is the average muscle activation for all strokes, for all subjects between our three conditions, as it progresses through the timing of one stroke. And you can see that for the left graph is the middle deltoid and posterior deltoid on the right. There is a little change in muscle activation. We can also see the same for the upper trapezius on the left and the middle trapezius on the right, with some deviation in the neoprene trial for the upper trapezius. However, this is not a significant difference. And finally, we have the latissimus dorsi on the left and the erector spinae on the right. Again, during the first half of the stroke, you can see that there is some variation in the erector spinae muscle activation. However, these are not significant. Moving on to our kinematic data, which includes the shoulder and elbow angles. We can see that there are no significant differences between any of our conditions. And so that includes the shoulder flexion range of motion, as well as our peak flexion and extension, and our adduction and abduction. And we could say the same for elbow range of motion, peak flexion, and peak extension. The final of our kinematic data includes stroke trajectory. The same can be said here. There are no significant differences between our trials, with the variables of stroke height, length, and width, and peak height in the minimum height. And we can also see this visualized. So we have the sagittal plane wrist trajectory with the vertical wrist trajectory in millimeters on the y-axis and horizontal wrist trajectory in millimeters on the x-axis. So you need to imagine that this graph is overlaid over this model here. So this is the start of the first stroke, or one stroke, and you can imagine that the right hand is up in front of the board. The arm comes down during the propulsive phase and ends up at the legs here, that is 50%. And then the arm comes forward again during the recovery phase, and the hand ends up at the end point above the board. And you can see that this is the average wrist trajectory for all strokes for all of our subjects between our three conditions. Moving on to our force and power data. Again, we could say that there are no significant differences between our conditions for peak force and peak power and the percent of stroke where those occur, as well as the mean propulsive power. And finally, we could see this visualized. So on the y-axis, we have force in newtons and power in watts, and again, the percent of stroke cycle on the x-axis. Each individual line is the progression of force over one stroke, and this is the data for one subject's trial for data collection. And you can see we have the average power in the solid black line and average force in the checkered black line, all occurring in the first 50% of the stroke. And our last data to look at is the questionnaire. So we asked the question, did the TPE wetsuit feel tight and did the TPE wetsuit feel loose? And the same two questions for the neoprene wetsuit. And our answers consisted of the arms, shoulders, chest, abdomen, back, and legs. And we could see that for the shoulders, our subjects were saying that they were tight in both wetsuits, and then the legs were loose in both wetsuits as well. When we asked the question, which wetsuit felt warmer, TPE and neoprene had almost the same frequency of response. We asked which wetsuit felt more comfortable, with TPE having almost twice the amount of responses as neoprene. And we also asked which wetsuit would you prefer to surf in, with TPE being nearly the same as neoprene. So a quick summary. So we do know that wetsuits are important for surfing. We know that neoprene suffers in areas that TPE may be able to improve on, which leads us to our research question, which is whether or not TPE is similar to neoprene in simulated paddling. And our hypothesis and results are that there are no significant differences between TPE, neoprene, or the subject's own board shorts. However, we need to talk about this a little bit. So first we have our average heart rate and oxygen consumption for control, TPE, and neoprene. And again, you can see that there are no significant differences between our values. However, we can compare this to Nessler 2015, in which subjects were asked to paddle in water in the flume. So that's an endless pool. And they paddled at 1.1 meters per second. And you can see that when you compare heart rate and VO2, subjects on the ergometer are paddling at an intensity that is much less than 1.1 meters per second. And this coincides with previous research that shows that when you compare a VO2 max test while paddling in an ergometer versus the flume, the ergometer has an underestimation of about 11% for VO2 max. For further comparisons, we can look at Nessler 2015. This is the exact same study as my thesis, but done in wetsuit tops. You can see that when you compare the neoprene wetsuit top to the neoprene full suit, we have similar values for heart rate and VO2. And this is interesting because the data suggests that as you transition from a wetsuit top to a full suit, you have no change in physiological differences. However, we do need to be cautious with this speculation as these are two different studies with two different sample sizes. Moving on to our biomechanical data. We do know that there are no significant differences, and we should only apply our data to low intensity submaximal speeds, as our physiological data suggests our subjects are paddling at low intensity, and we know that muscle activation can change dramatically between cruising and sprint paddling. And it'll be interesting to determine if TPE performs similarly to neoprene in a sprint paddling setting rather than a submaximal cruising speed as we have in the ergometer. For further comparisons, again in the wetsuit top study, they found a significant difference in middle deltoid activation as well as stroke height, whereas I did not. And when you compare paddling in a full suit compared to paddling in a wetsuit top, there is a lower stroke height by 64.5 millimeters and a shorter stroke length by 96.757 millimeters. And this is really interesting because the data suggests that as you transition from a wetsuit top to a full suit, you'll actually be reducing your stroke height as well as stroke length. However, we still need to be cautious again, as these are two different studies with two different sample sizes. And we would need a proper within subjects test to determine if there is a difference in our biomechanical data with different wetsuit styles and models. And finally, we have our questionnaire. So the limitation with my questionnaire is that I didn't ask if subjects preferred mobility over warmth or warmth over mobility. And this is a common topic that surfers go between when choosing a new wetsuit. The idea is that as you increase insulation, if the wetsuit, you're going to be increasing the thickness, which will have a reduction in the mobility of the suit. And there is perceptual data that shows that as you increase the thickness of a wetsuit top, there is a perceived decrease in the mobility of that suit. And although I can't answer this question on my own, Holmstrom 2019 asked the question, when you are buying a wetsuit, how important is mobility? With 100% of the subjects rating it at least a 5 out of 10. And this just gives us some insight into the possible reasons why subjects chose TPE over neoprene or neoprene over TPE for their preference to surf in. And it may be possible that this decision is based on their preference towards mobility rather than warmth. In addition, Holmstrom asks how important is durability, with 100% of his subjects rating it at least a 5 out of 10, and how important are sustainable materials, with 81% of subjects rating it at least a 5 out of 10 as well. And so we do know that surfers do prefer sustainable wetsuits that have high durability. However, these two factors may not coincide with each other. There are typically 3 layers to a wetsuit, with the most superficial layer being the jersey-like material that'll be interacting with the environment. And then below that, you have the neoprene layer. And then the final most interior layer is the fabric that'll be interacting with the skin. And so when you look at the TPE wetsuit of the neck, there is a noticeable difference, or there is a noticeable separation between our 3 layers after only 17 trials. And throughout the upper body, there is some slight separation in these seams of the TPE wetsuit, whereas in the neoprene wetsuit, there is no sign of any wear and tear. And this difference in durability may be due to the fact that there is a big difference in experience and refinement in the TPE wetsuit compared to the neoprene wetsuit. And as far as we know, this is the first time that TPE has been made into a wetsuit. And it's likely that over time, the durability of the TPE wetsuit or alternative wetsuit materials would improve as experience increases. Moving on toward limitations. So when you're paddling on the ergometer, there's no reference point. As you can imagine, when you're paddling in water, you're able to physically interact with the water level. So subjects were instructed to take or paddle as if they would in water. So that includes deep strokes as well as a high recovery phase, which includes lifting the hand out of the water. And so subjects were instructed to perform as if they were in water, and the water level was at chest height or about the height of the board. And they had to be constantly reminded to lift their hand above the water during the recovery phase. Otherwise, they revert into a sort of lat pull down motion, which may have changed the kinematics of the arm. In addition, the ergometer uses tethered paddles coming from a fixed point. As you can imagine, when you're paddling in water, you have the forces distributed along the entirety of the arm, whereas with the tethered paddles, all the forces are being directed to the hands, which may have also changed the kinematics of the arm while paddling. When we look at the ergometer watt output versus the transducer watt output, we can see some discrepancies. The ergometer is a reliable piece of equipment, however, it has not been validated. And so it may be possible that our subjects are paddling at a watt output that is less than our 20 watt requirement. However, we do know that our subjects are paddling at similar intensities between our three conditions. Moving on to wetsuit thickness. The wetsuits were designed and intended to be the same wetsuit thickness throughout the wetsuit. However, we did not measure this in lab. So there may be some slight differences based on the fact that these are two different materials. And in addition, this may also be attributed to the fact, potentially if there are differences, that there is much less experience creating a TPE wetsuit compared to neoprene wetsuit. And this also brings us to the topic of thermoregulation. So we are currently testing the thermoregulation of a 3.2 millimeter wetsuit that is a TPE in the 3.2 millimeter neoprene wetsuit. In the event that the TPE has same thermoregulatory capacities as the neoprene, then we may be able to suggest that TPE can replace neoprene wetsuits. In the event that the TPE performs worse than neoprene, it would be beneficial to determine at what thickness a TPE wetsuit is equivalent to the standard 3.2 millimeter neoprene model. And I think we'll have some more leeway in creating a thicker TPE wetsuit in regards to performance and comfort, as we see that there's almost twice as many subjects preferring the TPE over the neoprene wetsuit in regards to comfort. And finally, we have our statistical power. Our goal was 30 subjects over the course of 2 semesters. However, we were only able to collect data on 17 subjects due to COVID-19 halting our data collection. And in addition, when we look at our general effect size from my statistical analysis, for all of our variables, we have an average effect size of 0.021, and we have a range of 0.000597 to 0.116. And for these reasons, we need to be cautious or at least mindful of these limitations and potentially lack of statistical power when we talk about our conclusions. And our 2 conclusions are that based on our data, we can support our hypothesis with no significant differences in oxygen consumption, heart rate, muscle activation, arm kinematics, or force output between a neoprene and TPE wetsuit. And we can recommend that TPE wetsuits may be equivalent to neoprene wetsuits of comparable thickness and a valid replacement for future designs. And that is my thesis. Some cool surfing research. I have my references here. I also have the questionnaire as well as the statistical output, the N missing, and any forms that you may have questions on. I'd like to give some quick acknowledgements. Biggest acknowledgement probably to Emily Pilato. She's probably the biggest help in collecting data over the first semester, so I really appreciate the help. Daniel Kellogg and David Gomez, you guys are always helpful with data collection as well as the setup with the pilot data. I certainly couldn't have collected all of the data without the fall 2019 and spring 2020 CANES 326 and 425 students. I had a lot of equipment and it's really impossible to collect all that data at one time with one person. And then shouts to all the old wise guys, including Dr. Jeff Nessler, Dr. Sean Newcomer, Dr. Matt Schubert, Dr. Richard Armenta, and Matt Becker. You guys are always very helpful and are able to answer all of my many questions. And then the last acknowledgement is friends and family for always supporting me and making me a happy camper. And that is my presentation.
All right, great job, Tyler. At this time, we will open the presentation for questions from the audience. Ron, if you're trying to ask a question, you, okay, there you go.
Turn my mic on. Were there any skin thermistors, or is that part of the next round of measurements?
There were no thermistors included. That's part of Morgan's study, which we are doing currently, or we were before COVID.
The change in body temperature might be expected to show up for the oxygen consumption, I would speculate as well, but you saw no significant differences between the different wetsuits.
Yeah, and based on the difference in ergometer to Flume VO2 max, they did find a difference in those variables. So we should expect to see differences as well.
Thank you.
Hey, Tyler, it's Natalie. I have a quick question for you.
Yes.
First, I wanted to congratulate you. That was a great presentation. And I have to say that I think combining both exercise physiology and biomechanical data collection and analysis is a tremendous undertaking. I think you did a great job of doing all that and conveying all the results. I do have some questions about the I guess the protocol and a little bit of the subject characteristics. So I have like two questions, if that's okay. Could you maybe go to the table actually of
Characteristics?
Like the average heart rate, surf experience. Yeah, that slide. So given that the surfing competency, I guess, of your surfers seemed to be about, would you say that they were like intermediate surfers, recreational surfers?
Potentially. I haven't seen all of our subjects surfing in the water, so
Okay.
it's on their own
Right, self-reported.
visualization, yeah.
But as far as self-reported. So is there an average heart rate? Do you know of an average heart rate that surfers, recreational surfers experience during an average surf session?
Off the top of my head, no. There is that study by Dr. Newcomer that looks at different ages and heart rate over the course of an entire surf session, but I don't know how that changes. And I'm not sure if they broke that down into surf competency, but I definitely have the data to do that for my own study.
I was just curious to see if, for example, an average recreational surfer experiences a similar heart rate or workload compared to the protocol that you undertook, given the fact of a self-reported, it looks like you have self-reported intermediate recreational surfers. Just kind of curious how that might overlay and like how you might alter your protocol based off trying to elicit similar workloads.
Well, I think it would be expected that with increased surf competency, they would be more efficient at paddling. I can definitely do that with my own data. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess a little bit. I just was curious. I think that especially towards the end, you brought up that the Nessler et al. Paper, the 2017, that they were paddling at about 1.1 meters per second, which still seems actually relatively slow paddling velocity for an intermediate recreational surfer. And it looked like the heart rate and oxygen consumption for your study seemed even lower than that study. So I was just wondering if the workload, generally speaking, elicits enough of a response to see differences in the variables you were collecting.
I think so. It would be beneficial to determine at what cadence and what output corresponds to the VO2 max test, which is the 0.8 meters per second to the 1.8. As far as I know, I don't know what that comparison is, and this is just based on Nessler 2015, which was done in the wet tube tops.
Okay, cool. I have actually just like a little piggyback off that. So can you describe, did the subjects warm up at all before the 7-minute, I guess, protocol in each wetsuit?
No, they didn't have any warm up. Maybe like 3 or 4 strokes when we asked them to find a comfortable position, but there was no familiarization. No.
So I guess my question is, do you think that altering the SURF protocol to maybe have your subjects achieve a steady state and then collect data on this for example, 7 minutes would have elicited different results?
Potentially, but if you look at our VO2 data, where is it? Right here, we can see that prior to starting our data collection, our subjects are achieving steady state before 2 minutes.
Okay, cool. I think that was it. Good job. Congrats.
Thanks.
Other questions? I do not see any raised hands, but and we don't have anything in the chat. Tyler, you got some congratulations in there. Well, if there are no other questions at this time, we will ask that the audience leaves and that the committee will then meet individually with Tyler. So thank you for attending. We appreciate your time.
Tyler, I just wanted to quickly say great job.
Thanks, Richard.
Really great presentation. And congrats on finishing so early.
Thanks. I don't know what to do with my life now.
Look for jobs and do some more
You
research.
and everybody else.
All right, well, great job. I'll see you later.
Thank you.
All right, just us. Sean, did you fall asleep?
Yeah, I just woke up. That guy presents worse than Jeff. He's so monotone. Jeff is the worst I thought, but I think Tyler just took him for monotone right there.
I'm monotone, really? Rick.
I'm just kidding with you, Tyler.
No, you did great, man.
Yeah, you did a good job, man.
Thanks. Such a nice intro by Jeff.
I know.
What was that? I didn't think it was monotone, but
He's a big softie at heart.
So is Sean. Sean's a hard outer shell, but it's like soft as sand on the inside.
That's right. Soft to
he's a little prickly on the outside.
Yeah.
Prickly. I know another faculty member like that too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think you